It's a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Nilanjan Chatterjee today, who's going to be talking about cancer prevention and big data. So Dr. Chatterjee is a recent recruit as a Bloomberg professor here at Johns Hopkins. Prior to that, he worked at the Cancer Center. He's been here about a year. He's worked at NCI, was head of the Division of Biostatistics there, and has really led the charge in really developing some novel methods for both gene by environment, interaction, cancer epidemiological studies, and really has a large interest in improving and making better risk prediction models and improving cancer prediction, and really harnessing all the genomic data and big data that's out there to really transform cancer prevention efforts. So it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Chatterjee today.
All right, thank you for taking off from your lunchtime to listen to this talk. That's a great pleasure. And I think some of you heard this talk probably multiple times, like Allison. So I hope I'll have something still new to say. And so I noticed that, I think I promised, I'll give this talk a long time ago, and then I forgot to send a title. And then I suddenly saw that the title appeared, the cancer and big data. And so, but anyway, so I thought, I added a little bit, like cancer prevention and big data. So today, what I'm going to talk about, what could be the, is there an echo that you are hearing? Okay, maybe. So I'll talk about more about, on the prevention side, what would be the role of the big data. So many of you have heard, that the buzz about the precision medicine, starting from the initiative that Obama launched last year, and then if you think about what is the precision medicine they're talking about, so one of the big application of the precision medicine is going to be on the early application would be on the cancer treatment side, because of all the discovery that has happened in terms of our understanding of somatic mutations patterns in cancer tumors, how to use that information to target treatment, to develop more precision approach to cancer treatment. But a more long-term goal of this effort is described here, which is it's an emerging approach for disease prevention. That would be the long-term goal, taking into account people's individual variations in genes and environments and lifestyles. So, and this is closely related to also one of the more local initiative we have in Johns Hopkins, the individualized health initiative. So you can see that the goals are pretty similar, like the InHealth initiative as well as the precision medicine initiative. So let's think about a little bit of a concrete example, the kind of example I think a lot about, and this is an example I'm taking from my work on breast cancer. So this is so one of the things, if you think about the breast cancer, and currently, if you think about the average risk of a woman in the population, if you did not know anything about their risk factors, it would be about a lifetime risk about 12% at this range. And then if you think about the current recommendation for screening, who should be who screened at what age, at how frequent, that is mainly based on age. And we go back and forth between, the initial recommendation was 40, and then the recommendation got shifted by the US Prevention Task Force that we should really do at 50, because that's when the risk is high enough that it outweigh, the benefit you'll get from screening will outweigh the risks and the cost associated with it. And then if you go to American Cancer Society, it's 45, so it's all based on age. So if you think about why we use age to determine that what age women should start screening, because age is the strongest risk factor for not only for breast cancer, for many cancers, and many chronic diseases. So it makes sense to use age as the first surrogate for risk. But there is obviously many other risk factors which we have found in terms of both epidemiologic factors as well as we'll talk about a lot about genetics. And the idea is that not only use age, but use other risk factors to understand people's variations in risk. And for example, so this is an ideal distribution. If we could get that kind of distribution, suppose we could get a model which has many risk factors, and based on which we can, for example, assign risk of people in the population, and if we can get such a distribution, that would be really nice, because then, instead of just using age, we can use these other risk factors to predict risk, and then identify which people are, at different categories of risk who may be recommended for different level of interventions. Because not everybody, for example, like the people who are the highest risk, they probably are willing to do and make sense to do more intrusive interventions. Like for example, the moderate risk group, people may get regular screening, or the high risk group, they may do MRI scanning, and also like very high risk group, like people like what the 40% or 50%, they might even consider mastectomy. Like when some women who have BRCA1 and 2 mutation, they consider. So that's sort of so that's so for example that would be sort of for example, just again, this is not a current recommendation, but it's like like this could be think about like you can stratify people into different groups for which the recommendation will be different, so that you can maximize the benefit of these interventions and minimize the harm. So this would be sort of a vision for, let's say, precision prevention through screening for breast cancer. So to do that, so what we need, that we were through studies, we'll be identifying risk factors, and what we need to develop models for predicting risk for an individual given the set of risk factors for that person. And what such risk factor could include, like genetic susceptibility factors, environmental factors, biomarkers that that might come out of your studies, and traditional lifestyle factors, and so on. And I think so. That's why I think that this kind of models in the future will play a very critical role for public health and translation of the increasing etiologic knowledge of diseases. And so one of the theme I'll have in today's talk is that when you try to build this model, this will include a lot of different type of factors, epidemiologic factors, genetic factors, biomarkers, and things like that. And you may have a study, and a single study may not be have all the information. And first of all, it may not have all the information. They may not be large enough. There might be another large study which may not have as detailed information, but they are much bigger, right? We know that kind of studies. So one of the things we face is that like how to develop models using not only based on a single data set, but based on multiple data sets, which might have heterogeneous information. So that would be like one of the methodological theme I'll touch upon on today. So anyway, so this is sort of, I think, like that's sort of the, if you think about like what are the steps we need towards precision prevention from like discovery to practice, there are many steps involved. The first step is like where I think big data is going to play a big role, is the discovery. Like, and I'll go through examples through genome association study that why we need such a big sample size study to make the discovery which are true positives. And of course, there would be other type of high throughput studies, like that, like based on various kind of high throughput biomarkers studies. And I think that again for those discoveries, we'll need big data sets. But once we identify what are the risk factors, including biomarkers, then we have to start developing model, like how they act together in combination. And that means we have to start characterizing risk, joint risk associated with multiple factors. And today I'm going to talk about two topics around this area. One is this, how to develop models using genetic markers, and we call these models as polygenic risk score models because it includes multiple genetic factors. And then again, I'll come back to the how to combine information from multiple data sources. But there are many steps, and every step needs data, big data sets, as well as good statistical methods, because after you develop sort of the risk, like sort of the how they act together, we want to actually develop models to predict an individual's absolute risk of developing a disease in a future time over a particular time interval, which is relevant for that woman if she's trying to make a decision whether should I do screening in the next 5 years, or maybe she wants to think at a more longer perspective and she wants to look at lifetime risk for from other things. So we need to develop these models for absolute risk, which is often we do not focus. We focus in epidemiologic studies, we report relative risks and things like that, but that really does not tell you. So give you the right knowledge about for translation of this, what this relative risk means for public health interventions. And then you have to validate the model. That's, I think, one step we cannot skip, because we have seen often examples that after a lot of effort, we have developed a model, but then if you take an independent study, that it is not validating as well in terms of producing both unbiased estimate of risk as well as the discrimination it produces between people who do not have the disease and do not have the disease. So this is a very important step. And then, there are many things to think. Okay, you have a model, you think it is doing a good job in predicting risk, but what is its utility, right? To have, first of all, if you want to give risk and you want to do something about it, there needs to have some intervention that, that will be able to use it. So there are many things to think about, like in terms of what is the clinical utility, and then you have to think about like what are the potential applications for primary and secondary preventions, how to communicate the risk, the economics comes into picture heavily, and there are ethical issues as well. So let me start with this part, like how to develop models that using genetic markers that is coming out of genome-wide association studies. And this is what I will make a big pitch for, why do we need big data sets? And big means huge data sets I'm talking about, involving hundreds of thousands of individuals. So some of you, and probably many of you, know that the complex diseases like breast cancer are trying out to be, we are finding that they're highly polygenic, like it's true in general. So before the era of genome-wide association studies, through linkage studies of highly affected families, people used to find some genes which are pretty rare in the general population, but if you have the mutations, your risk could be pretty high. These are called high penetrant genes, like the famous BRCA1 and 2 gene is like one of those 2 genes. So they're, like, for example, relative risk could be about 10-fold, but they are pretty rare in the general population. So they don't, still in the families they explain a lot of disease, but if you go to the general population where breast cancer is pretty common, they explain a small fraction of breast cancer. So there are a lot of other things are going on. And that's where the more recent studies of like case control genome-wide association studies, where people are studying general cases from the population, where these are not cases who are coming from those highly loaded families, that has led to the discovery of many more variants. Like now there's more than 100 actually. This is a little old slide. There is the latest update is 150, and those have much more common. The allele frequency is much more common, but each of them individually only contributes to very modest risk. Like relative risk, we're talking about 1.2 or less. But there are many more. So in combination, like if you put 100 of them together, they actually start explaining more breast cancer in the population than, for example, BRCA1 and 2 will do. Because in combination, they start have substantial variation in risk. So what is the polygenic risk score? So just let me define it a little bit more formally. So it's basically nothing, it's a simple concept that basically it's a risk score for an individual that can capture the total genetic burden associated with the disease over many different variants and genetic loci. So for example, a polygenic risk score for an individual that you typically construct from a genome-wide association studies results is that you look at the SNPs, the genetic markers that has reached high level of significance, like genome-wide significance, and you consider, they are definitely associated, and they might sometimes are validated in independent studies, often. And then for an individual, you take those SNPs, and then you basically look at the total genetic risk associated, with this. For example, in the breast cancer, the example is saying there could be 94 different variants. And then you take the genetic risk score for this 94 variants is going to be the total number of, for example, risk allele you have over this 94 loci. And that would be a little naive, but you can actually weight the score based on the actual strength of the association of the variants with the disease. So that's where the beta hats come in the front. And so this is a very active area of research, like how to further improve and to performance of this model, or can we actually improve? Even first question is are we done? Like we have found 150 or genetic variants. Is that it? So that's something I'm going to next few slides is going to be about that how far we can take this. So to understand that what is the potential for this kind of genetic risk prediction, it's really useful to go back to these concepts of heritability. which is like many of you have heard from, estimates of heritability from twin studies or family studies. Like if you have breast cancer in your family, then maybe your risk, for in a first degree relative, the risk goes up by twofold. That comes from a twin study or a family-based study. So that would be a very first estimate of heritability that we are familiar with. And assuming that that lot of those heritability is coming from really genetics, not so much due to the shared environment. So at least a lot of it is due to the genetic part. Then you can think about that for every person there is an underlying true polygenic risk. And what is an underlying true polygenic risk that we may not be able to observe? But think about is all the genetic variance that is associated with breast cancer. And we know those genetic variants, and how, and whatever their association strength with the disease, based on that we can construct a true polygenic risk score for an individual. And the variation of that true polygenic risk score in the population, like if you think about that variation in the population, suppose that's sigma, and that's the measure of heritability. And you can show that measure of heritability, that the variability of the polygenic risk score, the true polygenic risk score, is basically has a 1-to-1 relationship with the estimates of familial relative risk and things like that. It's just a mathematical way of doing it. And so basically, a more heritable a disease is, right? So that distribution is going to be more spread. Like that polygenic risk score, underlying polygenic risk score, will have more spread in the population. And so you can see if the disease is more heritable, then based on at least using the underlying true polygenic risk score, we should be able to spread people more in the high risk and low risk. And if a disease is less heritable, then the spread would be less. So what I'm trying to get at, heritability is kind of gives you a sort of a limit, how far we can do using genetic risk spread, because there's the maximum we can get. But think about so if you think about a risk of a disease, have a genetic component, let's suppose polygenic risk score, that's the true polygenic risk score, and there is a environmental component, and there is an underlying, let's say, environmental risk score. That's a combination of the environmental factors that contribute to the disease, and suppose things are independent and nicely adds up, there's not much interaction in the log scale. And then basically this variability associated with the genetic part can be also further partitioned into what type of effects we are talking about. Right? It could be due to some of these effects could be coming from the common variants, like the coming from genome-wide association studies. The rare variants, we already talked about some rare high-penetrant variants is already known to be associated, but we have not studied rare variants very exhaustively yet through a genome-wide approach. And there could be some interactions between different types of variants. And each type of effects can contribute to the heritability. But so far, if you think about the genome-wide association studies trying to find out how much we can do using the common variants. And so this is so one of the things you can do using genome-wide association study, other than trying to identify individual variants, you can actually, there are some cool techniques that allows you to estimate what is the total variability or the heritability of a disease that can be explained by the whole SNP array. Not just the SNP that has reached genome-wide significance, okay, because they have the biggest effect. There could be many, many SNPs which are smaller effects, and they did not make it to the genome-wide significant level. But this variance component, there are very cool variance component techniques available that allows you to estimate how much of the disease variance or the heritability can be explained by all the genetic markers that are there. So here's an example, so we did for a cross-cancer heritability analysis using a large number of genome-wide association studies, just to get an idea. So these up to all the columns except the last one, these are estimates of sibling relative risk from various family registries. So just to keep in, maybe let's fix one registry, like Utah. Okay, so there is some heterogeneity between the registry. And so, for example, if you look at the bladder cancer, if you have a first-degree relative in your family who has bladder cancer, then your risk goes by 80%, like 1.84. Okay, and then we estimate from that out of that 1.84, like about 1.4 familial risk could be explained by the variants that are included in the genome-wide association study platforms. So across all disease, so in general, of course, you would expect this number to be less than this because this is the total heritability, and this is the heritability due to the common variants included in GWAS. So, and you see that generally it's much less, but across all cancers, you see that actually, the common variants are going to explain substantial amount of familial relative risk. And here what I'm showing is that at least this was a 1-year-old paper. Things in GWAS, moves very quickly, so it's slightly old. But what I'm trying to show here is so this is the heritability estimates, but I'm showing it in a little different scale, not the familial relative risk scale. This is in the liability threshold scale. So it's a slightly different scale. So ignore the absolute number for a moment, okay? But what I wanted to compare is that this is the estimate of heritability, the total heritability from GWAS. That means that including all the SNPs in the platform. And this is the estimate of heritability after we take out the SNPs that has reached genomoid significance for that cancer. So for example, bladder cancer, there are about 15 SNPs that are known to be now associated with bladder cancer. So you wanted to take out and see how much left, okay? And this we did for every cancer, okay? And we see that every cancer, there is a lot of things we left. Actually, more things are left than has been discovered. And sometimes, typically we have explained, that out of the total GWAS heritability, some 10%, many cancers it's only 10%. Some other more common cancer like breast cancer or prostate cancer is like maybe 30% and 50% because the sample size is larger there. So just to elaborate on the point that what is going on, that we have very big studies, that and we are saying that we have found something, and we are also saying there are more to be found. Okay, so let me give you an example that I might think make you give you an idea like what is going on here. So I'm doing this as a based on again using breast cancer as a model. Okay, and remember I told you that you can analyze GWAS data to estimate heritability explained by the common variants. But not only that, there are methods which is not only estimate the total heritability, but it can also estimate how many variants are likely to be there, which is associated with breast cancer, and what is their effect size distributions. We developed some of these methods, and then we analyzed breast cancer, the genome-wide association studies, and we found that the models which are consistent with the given data suggest that there are thousands of genetic markers that can contribute to the heritability for breast cancer. Like about, for example, in this case, we're saying that there are about 4,000 genetic markers out of 500,000 genetic markers we are studying that are associated with the breast cancer. And this shows the distribution of the odds ratios for those effects. So you can see, like, what is happening is that there are very few SNPs with large effect. Large means in the GWAS standard, 1.2 odds ratio, 1.15 odds ratio. And there are more and more SNP with very, very small effects. And there could be thousands and thousands of them. And so what I'm showing here is that this gray line is the power curve for the study, which has 60,000 case and 60,000 control. And that is the sample size for the biggest study that happened last year, up to the last year. Now there is a bigger study. So what I'm showing is that that study, because it has 100% power, for up, let's say 1.1 odds ratio or larger, right? So that means it has found all that has to be found, those SNPs which has bigger than, effect bigger than 1.1 odds ratio. But it has missed out a lot of these SNPs in this 1.04, 1.05 range. And then this shows the projections that if we do larger and larger studies in the future, that I know what would be the power curve, and then you can show that we can basically going to chip in the SNPs that we have not found so far. But we had 0 power before, so we haven't seen any of those SNPs. We're going to start finding them. And so what I'm showing, and look at the sample size I'm talking about. So this is 60,000, this is 200,000, this is 500,000 cases and 500,000 control. And in this side, I'm showing that if I take all those SNPs which we'll find in those studies and put it in a genetic risk prediction model, and then we see what is the discriminatory ability between cases and controls. That sometimes you characterize by the area under the curve, and if you use that as a metric, like how good the model is doing, and this is our projection that currently using the best model, we might be able to get area under the curve of 62.3%. And as we increase the sample size, and we'll find more and more things, and we're going to slowly improve those models. And remember, the limit is the heritability. Okay, that can be only achieved if you have infinite sample size. But to reach close to that limit, to reach at least a plateau, like after which is not worth it probably doing any bigger studies, you see that the plateau is not reached until you have 500,000 cases and 500,000 control. And this is happening that you need such a big studies to get really basically the potential of these studies that is hidden. The hidden heritability is really due to the fact that these diseases are highly polygenic. Okay, if this was a slightly less polygenic, suppose I consider this. So this is the empirical model. But let's suppose a theoretical model. I consider. Suppose that we just explain the same amount of heritability, but using less number of SNPs. Like instead of 4,000, we explain by 1,000 SNPs. And so in this case, each SNP on average has bigger effects, right? Because in total, they're explaining the same amount of variance. Then see what happens. See, things will move much faster. That we will find these things, those 1,000 SNPs, as we increase the sample size, will reach the plateau very quickly. Like for example, in this figure, if you look at the AUC, by the time we do a study of, let's say, at least 100,000 cases, 100,000 control, will basically reach a plateau. So you can see that the fact that we need huge sample sizes is really due to that how polygenic these diseases are. And we are finding not only for breast cancer, but for other cancers, as well as other diseases, things are extremely polygenic. And in fact, some other like psychiatric diseases, if you look at schizophrenia, the number of estimates we have for some of these genetic markers gets into tens of thousands. So that's why in psychiatric disease is even harder. Like they will need even bigger sample size. But as they are doing these studies, they're finding these lot of small effects. So I think what I try to convince you that was that really it is a sample size. That's the key factor for much more so than any statistical methods. That would be the key factor that how good a model you'll be able to build based on for this genetic risk prediction. And that's why I think it's really interesting to because the one way to get this information from very big study is to get this summary level information that is often available through consortium effort. Like where when I say summary level information means that they typically all GWAS studies they do meta-analysis across multiple studies for each SNP at a time. You get odds ratio and standard errors based on, like, for example, I work on a breast cancer association consortium. They have now 300,000 people, and and it's very easy to, relatively easy, not very easy. You still have to go through data application process and stuff like that. It's much easier to get those odds ratio parameters for individual SNPs and their standard errors than trying to access the individual level data. Okay. But those odds ratio parameters, although it is not the individual level data, it contains a lot of information. It contains information from 100,000 people or 200,000 people. So it has gotten very interesting statistically that how you can build model based on those summary level information to come up with good model for polygenic risk scores that will include all the SNP together in a model, not in one at a time. And so this has become a statistical genetics is a hot area, like how to analyze summary level data to do things which you can do if you had individual level data. So I'll give you one example, for example, from very recent work. Alison is part of that because we use also pancreatic cancer, but this is not pancreatic cancer. This is type 2 diabetes. So what we did something very we showed that. So remember I talked about you can do polygenic risk score based on SNPs that reach genome-wide significance, and then see how good those polygenic risk score is performing in independent data sets. Okay, but you don't have to if you only care about if you really care about more prediction performance, and you do not so much that you got all the SNPs in your set to be high confidence that they are associated. Okay, if that's more hypothesis testing, but for prediction you don't care so much about whether in the set you selected all of them are truly associated. You care about whether together they're improving prediction. And if that is your view, then there is no reason to stick to the genome-wide significance threshold for selecting SNPs. So here what I'm showing is that suppose I selected, so I'm developing a model based on summary level association statistics from a large consortium of type 2 diabetes studies, and I'm selecting SNPs based on some threshold. It could be genome-wide significance threshold or more liberal threshold. And then developing the polygenic risk score, and then I'm trying to see how well that model performs in an independent data set. And this is showing the model performance in a scale of R squared. Okay, so again, don't worry too much about the absolute scale. Look at the relative performance. So what you can see that and then this is this so this is the blue line, shows the performance of this polygenic risk score if you include more and more SNPs with more stringent, more liberal threshold. And you see that, you don't see a clear pattern here. Because, for example, this was done for schizophrenia, as I said, one of the psychiatric diseases where things are much more complicated. They showed, that if you make a more liberal threshold, you can actually improve the performance a lot more. But in type 2 diabetes, we are not seeing it. But what we did was that we used this correction to the coefficient, what is called Wiener's curse correction. See, what happens is that when you're selecting SNPs to have a very high significance level, that means they're, the statistics, the association statistics is larger than some value, right? And then you are using the same data to estimate the effects, right? And that effects is, if you actually got an independent study, it will be less. You are expected to be less because this is the Wiener's curse problem. So, but we didn't have an independent study to re-estimate the parameters, but there are mathematical way of correcting that bias. This is called Wiener's curse correction. So you take the same set of SNPs, but when you take the coefficient, we just don't take the coefficient estimates like the odds ratio estimate that we get from standard analysis. We make some correction for the Wiener's curse. And then things become much more clearer. We can see that actually there is clearly, by including more SNPs in the model, we are improving the performance. And this correction is, what we consider a lasso type correction, because there's a very popular machine learning algorithm that people use to analyze data when you have individual level data. And we showed that this is basically, of course, we do not have the individual level data, so we cannot fit the lasso algorithm. But this is a poor man's lasso, that the corrections we did, it's all based on summary level data, right? So, but the corrections we did, it will be an approximate version of the lasso if you had independent SNPs. And then the other thing we wanted to see, there are a lot of interest in GWAS analysis, those people who are involved, that how to, better use of information on the SNP characteristics, their functional information, whether they predict some kind of expression level or methylation level in some tissues of interest, or you have wonderful data from ENCODE from different cell lines about based on their physical location, whether you can predict what is likely there, whether they're in the conserved region or the DNA hypersensitivity site. So those informations are there, but we have not so far been using those information. And the idea is that you think that those information can be useful to sort of prioritize SNPs. That if you think that this SNP is predicting methylation level in a tissue, pancreatic tissue that is relevant for type 2 diabetes, you may think that those SNPs are more likely than other SNPs in the genome to be associated with type 2 diabetes risk. So how do you use that kind of information in a very simple-minded way? So what we did again is show that we use basically a combination of information about expression, methylation, and histone modification information from this cell line to come up with a two group of SNPs. One is considered high priority SNPs. These are few thousand SNPs out of the hundreds of thousands of SNPs we are studying. This is a relatively small group, which we think this is more likely to be associated with type 2 diabetes than the other group. Okay, and then how do we use that information for developing the polygenic risk score model? So we said, okay, then if you have two groups, and one group we think is more likely with enriched with signal, let's use a different threshold. Okay, because if I think that these are more likely to be associated, then maybe I can use a more liberal threshold. But I don't have to decide that what threshold I'm going to use. If I have a independent data set, I can do a search, I do this here. I'm doing a one-dimensional search, right? Because I'm treating all SNPs to be equal. So I'm just trying to see what threshold I choose to make the performance optimal. But here I have two groups of SNPs, and I said I'll use two sets of threshold, and then and for every different combination of my threshold, I get a polygenic risk score, and I see what's the performance of the polygenic risk score in an independent data set. And that's the plot for that R square. And what you can see that when you look at the optimal threshold, and you see that actually that it is doing what it is supposed to do, that it is getting for the SNPs which we chose to be the more high priority, the optimal threshold is actually more liberal than the other SNPs in the genome. And that suggests that the selection of the SNPs we did is actually enriched with probably the type 2 diabetes signal. Because if there was no differential enrichment, they will collapse because there is no more information. So again, this is a very simple way of using the functional information. If you have categorized into maybe 2 or 3 groups, And but there are more fancier way of doing it. And then we saw that actually that compared to like just using, without using the functional information, you can have some improvement in the model performance. From here to, these are the best performing model if you do one-dimensional search, and this is the best performing model when you're doing taking the functional information into account to build the model. Okay, so that's sort of, I have, so this is a, very challenging, I would say, but for statisticians, very exciting area, to improve models, develop more, improve methods to build models for polygenic risk prediction, utilizing all kind of information like functional information, GWAS information, other type of information to build. But it is a quite challenging area. We were very happy to see if we can move the AUC curve by 0.5% by using a method, then we think we have done it. But the thing is that we know that it is there, because from the heritability estimate and all that stuff I was saying, that it's a very unusual setting we don't see in other places where in other study we are doing a high throughput study metabolic, we're doing whole metabolic profile and we do some study, right? And you just do not know how much to be found in the future, right? But this is a very unique type of studies, I would say, that here you actually know that how far you can go, because based on this heritability estimate. It's just how to go there. And the point I was trying to make is that sample size would be the critical, and then the remaining would be about the statistical method to take out the whatever the juice you have in the given data set you are working with. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the next part of my talk, which is a little bit more technical, but I will hope that it will generate a lot of excitement in a lot of people, because this kind of data everybody faces. And we started thinking about this very seriously, because we were trying to build a model using multiple risk factors, not genetics in this case. This genetics is relatively simple, because nowadays GWAS data is becoming more and more available. But if you think about your epidemiology risk factors, which requires, or biomarkers or some kind of data from some sensors, it's expensive, right? And you don't have in all studies in the same quality, but maybe partially have in some studies, in the other studies they don't, but they have something else, right? The question is that, how will I combine information from all these studies to build better models instead of analyzing just one study? And so this is motivated from multiple sources. So this is the advantage, I think, the big data sources versus analytic studies. Because nowadays we have mega consortia, through the Genome Association studies, population registries, healthcare databases. They have strength in size, but may lack all the relevant variables you care. But you might have a very really well-designed analytic studies, which you have put a lot of effort in a relatively small sample, but collected all very information in a lot of details. So analytic studies are smaller, but may collect more detailed information to address specific hypotheses of interest. So the question is that, how do you combine information, from two different types, this kind of data sets, best. And this is what motivated me to originally to develop this methodology, which I'll talk about the calculus of it a little bit thing. But we are doing more recent work to further generalize it in a meta-analysis framework. So this is the same, for example, you do gene-environment interactions or modeling biomarkers, and you have multiple sources, how to develop a single unified model. So what is happening? So what was the critical challenge? And I thought that was a nice observation we made, and that is letting us actually really push this field. Is that so you can, if you think about that analytic study based in which you can develop extensive models, many risk factors, okay? And that is the ideal model you would like to build, with a rich set of risk factors. And then we have that external data set, which is the big data, which has a much smaller number of variables, but bigger sample size. So from that model, you can, and it is the same outcome you are studying, let's suppose, okay? You can develop a reduced model, that means with the rest set of risk factors, but the model parameters is going to be much more precise. Okay, so if we can understand what's the relationship between the parameters in this model in a very general way, then only I can combine the information. So that's what that's what is the critical thing we did in this paper, and I'm not going to let me try at least how, to explain through geometry, okay? But at the end, you have to believe me that this is possible. So again, what I talked about, you want to have a full model that you would like to develop using your analytic data set, which has a lot of risk factors. That's the ideal model you'd like to build. And let's suppose that model has sets of risk factors, let's say X and Z, okay? And if you have your own study, you can just fit that model to your own data and then done. This is the standard logistic regression, linear regression, Cox proportional hazard model. You don't worry about what other people did. That's what we are doing currently. But suppose somebody else has fitted another model, okay, and that is a reduced model, what I consider. That means that they have less factors in the model. So they don't have the factor Z. And they have fitted a model, and they have fitted some kind of parametric model. For example, it could be logistic regression or probability regression, but at least the same outcome. You have the same outcome. And then they have estimated the parameters of that model, theta. And maybe you don't even have the data. You just have somebody has told you that, okay, I have this model fitted into this bigger study based on this set of risk factors, and these are the model parameters. I don't even have the individual level data from that side, because that's much more difficult, right, for approaching people or getting these huge data sets from extracting it, difficult. So the question we pose that somebody gave us the estimate of the parameter, can we use that information to do a better modeling in this space? And geometrically, it makes sense that you should be able to do it. Okay, so you think about that. You're trying to fit your model, and this is what your true model is. That's what you're trying to get at. You're trying to estimate, and this is a more expensive model. But that more expensive model means that this model corresponds to a probability distribution for the reduced model. That if I say that this is the probability of the disease is supposed to be given your two sets of risk factor, and that's how it's supposed to vary, then that and then if you know the distribution of the risk factors, then that automatically imposes a model for what should be the probability of the disease given the only one risk factors. So there is a relationship, and so you can think about that. If somebody has fitted a model of the parametric model of this form, so they might that the true probability you get may not belong to this parametric model, but we know that again there are some nice classical statistical theory that says that the model you are fitting, that if suppose you are doing maximum likelihood type of theory, then that estimate you get, it basically minimizes some kind of distance from this space to that true probability distribution function, and you can write down the math behind it. Okay, and so that allows you to basically use this equation, this model parameter, to set up an equation for the parameters in beta. So this is, think about, what we do if you're doing like a likelihood-based inference. Like again, forget the math. Just think about you're doing logistic regression or linear regression. You have your own data. We usually do likelihood-based inference. That means we are maximizing some kind of likelihood like this, model which involves the model parameters. Okay, and you can have some complex sampling design, that to account for and things like that. But what we showed is that if you have external information, you can convert those information on the reduced model to a set of equations for the parameters of interest, and through that geometry and some math. So that means that instead of doing ordinary maximum likelihood, just ignoring this piece of information, you can do constrained maximum likelihood. That means you want to maximize the parameters of your model in a space that is consistent with the parameters of the model that you already know, that is coming from the big data sets, right? So it makes sense. Like even if you forget the math, that should put some constraint. And so we are taking this just one step further, because this is just why two study. So now think about very generally. Suppose you have different studies, case studies, and each study is giving a set of risk factors, and then and if you're trying to develop a multivariate model, the standard approach you'll do is the meta-analysis. Am I running out of time? Okay. So just I'll quickly say what we are trying to do is that. So what's the most popular approach for synthesizing information from multiple data sources? It's still the meta-analysis, right? That GWAS, this has been the method. Clinical trial meta-analysis is the method, and I'm just showing what is the formula for multivariate meta-analysis? That you weight the variance, the beta hat vector, and the multivariate parameters by the inverse of the variance covariance matrix, and then you take the sum. So, but the problem is that when you try to do multivariate risk modeling, the problem is that different studies have different variables. Okay, they don't have all the same variables, and that's why this formula breaks down. And so what we try to develop a new method for multivariate meta-analysis where you can have different studies with different sets of covariates. Some of them will overlap, and some of them will not. Okay, and the task we proposed is that can we develop a model that will include all the risk factors that encompasses all the studies, using the these submodels that each study fits, and gives you the estimates and the variance covariance matrix, and a data set to estimate the joint distribution of all the covariates, the risk factor. Because unless you understand what is the relationship between the different risk factors, then you have no hope to put them in the model, right? So you need a data set, and we call this a reference data set, from which you are going to estimate. And that does not need to be linked to the outcome information or anything. You just need that data set. It could be some external to your studies that will give you an idea about what is the joint distribution of the risk factors in that population. And this could be a very small data set compared to the main study. And we showed that using this theory, I showed that you can develop a very general method for doing meta-analysis of these multivariate models when these models do not have the same variables. And you can get the same model. Of course, it's limited, right? You cannot study interactions between variables which are not ever studied together. That you cannot do. But you can put them in the model. Even if they are correlated, it will automatically correct for the correlations using that correlation information. So we are very excited about it because this has a lot of potential, including we are thinking about application in the ECHO cohort, in the ECHO program, where one of the big tasks is how to do the cross-cohort meta-analysis in that program, which is a big consortium. And this has a bunch of very heterogeneous study. And the whole idea is how to pool that data, and when the cohorts have actually measured a lot of different things. Anyway, so I'm going to come to the, let me see, just a few take-home messages. Let me see. Go to that. So I think what I tried to say, the risk of many complex diseases, including breast cancer and other cancers, are associated with thousands of common genetic variants. So these are highly polygenic, and that is why we need so big data sets to develop model for genetic risk prediction for complex diseases. And the other main thing, I think the theme of the talk was that there are new methods available to do meta-analysis of very heterogeneous studies, and to develop more unified model that we are currently developing. Thank you.
Hello. I actually had, this is a great talk. I have a whole bunch of questions. Let me just ask one simple one. So you're doing the genetic side, and then you're trying to incorporate the environmental, the exposure side. How do you think of epigenetic markers? Do you think of them as just maybe indicators of exposure, or as an intermediate category, a third category?
It could be both, right? I think there could be epigenetic markers, right, which are indicator of exposures. And then it could be the intermediate variable also. But I think in terms of risk prediction, so one of the things, if you think of it just as a biomarker, whether I can use it as a biomarker that will improve risk prediction. So from that perspective, I think in principle, yes, but the problem is that, we need to have biomarkers which could be measured in a simple way. For example, you can find, for example, in the epigenetic markers, we know from tissues and things like that are, important to understand the disease mechanism. But if you think about whether it will be a useful biomarker for risk prediction, it may not be so much, right? Because this is not something you can get from tissue, from healthy people to measure these. Whereas genetic factors, you can get it from the saliva sample or simple blood sample. So I think So like, I think it's very important, obviously, because we know that epigenetics is a very important mechanism, and we need to keep studying to understand that. But I think that in terms of how much that would be useful for risk prediction, I think that's something to be seen.
Going back to your topic on the traditional meta-analysis, usually investigators have to choose between a fixed and random effects model with different assumptions of the extent of between study heterogeneity. And so I was wondering if you could discuss how your method incorporates that assumption of between study heterogeneity, and whether or not you would still be able to detect differences in things like methodological heterogeneity, like differences in the population or setting and so forth, from the different sources of data that you're pulling together.
That's a very good question. It's a very challenging question. I know there could be heterogeneity between the population in multiple aspects. Okay, one of the things we have to deal with, which you do not have to deal with, if you assume that every study has the same set of risk factors, that what's the distribution of the risk factors? Because you think about, like, it's a missing data problem, right? Because some studies have this risk factor, but other studies do not have. So in some of our calculation, we have to sort of estimate the distribution of the risk factors, right? So that's something we have to think about. Like, first of all, is the model parameters is the same? That is the usual question in meta-analysis. But then there's another layer of complication, that is the distribution of risk factors are the same. Okay, so we are thinking about how to relax the assumption about, that there is a common distribution. Okay, but of course, to be able to do that, you need a small reference data set to estimate the distribution from each study. That means you need more data. And then going back to the usual question, whether the risk parameters of your logistic model or something, they are whether there could be some heterogeneity across studies. At this point, we are developing fixed effect model, as the first step. But that would be a great question to then think about, like, if we think about heterogeneity in the risk parameters, and if we think about random effect models, how these kind of things work. We haven't gone that far. I mean, I'm trying to develop the fixed effect meta-analysis so far. But that's something I have in mind.
Thanks. Thanks for your talk. You talked about, this is a bit of a philosophical question. You talked about how heritability gives us sort of a ceiling for how good we can do with a polygenic risk score. Right. Is there any way to think about a ceiling when we also incorporate environmental effects? Can we, for instance, try to estimate the effect of randomness and subtract from one? Or have you thought about this sort of thing?
It's a very good question. I don't know, like how you do in environmental factors in general, because the genetics, one of the advantages that you have the fixed set, right? That these many million of genetic variants you are studying, right? And that set is fixed, right? And so, if you have to do a study, you have information from all potential genetic variants, right? And that is allowing you to estimate what is the ceiling. But when you have environmental variable, of course, let's think about, instead of a particular environment, let's suppose another technology, let's say microbiome. Okay, that's allowing you to estimate, different kind of, microbiome profile, in a very large scale using some platform. Okay, and I do think that some of this heritability estimation technique can be applied there to say, in the metabolomic profile in general, how much potential it has to explain variability of a particular trait. Okay, because that statistical techniques people are using, it has nothing to do with being heritable. Okay, it can be used for, other high throughput technology. But the more philosophically going, the environment is, very broad, right? So I cannot say that, what is environment? You have to tell me, right? That, I mean, what are the variables we are talking about, right? And that set is not finite to me. That's why, it's difficult to make a comment about the environment as a whole. But if you come up with a technology that gives you a way to measure a lot of, let's say, chemicals in your, blood, right? And then you do some epidemiologic studies and show that you have risk estimates available for a certain disease with many different chemicals that you can measure. Based on that, it's possible to estimate that how much in variability of the disease or a trait can be explained by this kind of chemicals. But still, it's a finite set. Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, that anticipates my question very much. I was going to ask you how if you had an exposome type of
Yes.
analysis or microbiome, would you have to do a sort of a parallel, embark on a parallel effort to analyze the risk through the, the thousands of chemicals that might be in your exposome analysis, and that sort of essentially double or triple your analytical effort or computational effort?
Yeah, but I like some of this principle could be applied to the the exposome type of setting. But you have to talk about what is your exposome. But I think that that some of the issues are that is not faced in genetics because of some natural advantage, because the genetics is not so much confounded with a lot of other things. But when you go to environment, right, getting these kind of samples, because in genetics, for example, they could get away with murder, because they could take cases and controls violating all kind of principles we know about epidemiology. Because you think about, the genetics is not so much to do with, they don't affect selection and things like that. So they got pretty valid results by doing case control studies where the controls are not well designed, matched to the cases and things like that. But if you want to do it in environment, it's going to kill you. So I think that getting the sample, that kind of, although in principle you can do it, but getting that sample size, because you have to be more careful about your selection of cases and controls, and make sure that you have taken care of the confounding factors, is going to be harder.
Let me ask you a follow-up then. Your second part of your talk about the alternative or the new methods. There are a lot of, if you just take even one environmental chemical, there are a lot of studies on some chemicals anyway in great depth. And could you sort of do this meta-analysis sort of thing and incorporate them into your risk prediction for a disease, at least for some chemicals?
I need to understand a little bit more about what you're talking about. But I think what you're describing is quite possible. Those are the things, like for which we develop. That, that you can have multiple studies. And, that sometimes what happens not only is different set of covariates, is that they're trying to measure the same thing, but they have different instruments. That they have, like some are doing better job than the other, and, in terms of instrument. So this method should be able to handle those kind of, pulling those kind of data together.
Are there any additional questions? If not, thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here.